This is exciting for Sue and I to be, it's exciting for me. I don't know if it is for you, for us to be speaking together. I was hired at Highline College where Sue was working in 2008 or so, and so Sue and I got to work together in Seattle for a number of years, and now she doesn't live there anymore, but we get to give talks together from time to time. So this is fun, and honestly, I'm talking about intro psych today because Sue has been talking about intro psych for a long time, and she kind of made the way for very interesting conversations. And if you get the chance to have a one-on-one with Sue, I think many people have found that she really gets instructors and instructors' problems with intro psych or their challenges with it. So today, though, we want to talk about two things, kind of the ripple effect of intro psych and the potential of intro psych. And that's kind of where I'm going to talk, what I'm going to talk about for the first little bit of this conversation. And then Sue is really going to bring it home with some practical considerations, some real, some things I think that excite you because it kind of shows a way forward. At least when I hear her talk about these things, it really does excite me. So we will also give you just a chance at the end. We want to leave plenty of time to have a conversation. So we will try to do that in case you have questions or comments or you just need a place to vent about intro psych because it's super challenging. So does everybody in here, I imagine most of you teach intro psych? Yes, sort of. Okay. Mostly yes. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the ripple of introductory psychology because, well, Sue and I kind of have a bias that intro psych should do some particular things in students' lives and in communities and in the world. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, I'm at this very particular point in my career right now. I'm like 20 years into teaching introductory psychology, and I was on a sabbatical this year, and I took what Ken Keith said in the keynote this morning very seriously, which is you should, ignorance is fine. If you want to be like a scientist, then it's fine to be ignorant sometimes. That's how you learn new things. Well, I have put myself in a very ignorant position right now because everything that I have done over the last 20 years, everything I built in my introductory psychology course face-to-face, I decided to tear down and rebuild over this last sabbatical year. And you'd think like, great, that's like such a great opportunity. And then you actually start doing it and it is, it's a bit of a nightmare, and I'll talk about that. But also, I learned a whole lot of stuff about that. But I think one person said it to me, Garth, you've gone from expert back to novice, and that's what it feels like, and which is scary, but in the end, it's good, and it's really good for my students. It's good to keep me fresh, and so I'll tell you a little bit about that. But the ripple of introductory psychology is, I just like the metaphor to think that what we do will not only go out from students into their neighbors and communities, but it will also kind of move forward with students in their lives and benefit them. And so, again, a bias that I have. Now, I like big ideas, and the big idea here starts with the American Psychological Association because this is actually something they put out in, I think it was February, which is, this is a review of their strategic plan. Now, APA has only had 2 strategic plans in 130 years, and so we are in the middle of one of their kind of strategic plans. I remember being in DC years ago, probably right when this was kicking off, and they were just talking about impact. Why? How does this have impact for psychology, for undergraduate psychology? And then I saw that they started to put this into print. Impact in action. This is the review report of how are we doing with our strategic plan. I think this is kind of interesting because this reminds me that psychology is actionable, that psychology should affect change in our world, that it's not just psychologists finding out some stuff, or as Sue and I were just talking with Ken Keith and Barney Bynes about kind of history of psych. History of psych is not just something happened and then something else happened and then something else happened. There's a story there that means something to us, that means something to human beings. And so I like to see that APA put this out. They redid their mission statement a little while ago. This is APA's mission statement. And I'll just read it: to promote the advancement, communication, and application of psychological science and knowledge to benefit society and improve lives. Okay, so now we see this trickling down, from this strategic plan, and now it's in the mission statement, or maybe that's the reverse. The mission statement's first, and then the plan comes. And that's what psychology is supposed to do: benefit society and improve lives. And I think maybe easier said than done, because, let's just do that. Okay, that's easy. But, we deal with students who have complex challenges, and in an introductory psychology course, that's students only getting psychology from you, generally. I mean, most students are not going to take other psychology courses, and so you have that limited time. I'm on a quarter system, so I have 11 weeks to make an impression. Yeah, 11 weeks to make an impression. The good news for me is that we just started. We're in like week 3 or 4 right now. In September, it's very nice in Seattle in September, and so you really don't want to go back too quickly. The bad news comes in June when I'm still in the classroom. Let me just say that I think that I've done some work on mission statements. I'm going to give a workshop later on personal professional mission. But the measure of any good mission statement is how actionable is it, especially in different parts of the organization. Are people aligning with that mission? Is it usable? And APA guidelines for the undergraduate psychology major 3.0 just came out. I am very proud to be part of this work. I am proud that this work has this fingerprint of what APA wanted to do with that mission on it. You can see this is the mission of Guidelines 3.0 is empowering people to make a difference in their lives and community. So we start to see that there's a trend here that APA is really doubling down, and it's getting into kind of undergraduate curriculum and recommendations now that we should be teaching in a way that is going to have a positive impact. So a couple years ago, I saw this article come out in a special issue, and this is Guy Boyson and Kathy Becker-Blees, who were doing the editing for this issue, wrote this. John Cacioppo once said that teaching introductory psychology is fundamentally different than from teaching other courses. In other courses, teachers shape people's careers. In introductory psychology, teachers change people's lives. And that, what's that?
No pressure.
Yeah. Like I said, it's easy.
Easy.
Right. Yeah. The problem with some of these kind of big ideas is that how do they actually work themselves out in our classrooms, right? Or how do they work themselves out in course design? How do they work themselves out when you're covering something that you have that's a lot to cover in just an hour? Can you really get to that actionable, meaningful piece? I think you can, and that's the case I think I'm going to make today and Sue's going to make, and we'll see how closely we align on that in the end. We might fight in front of you. I don't know. That'd be kind of interesting. The American Psychological Association put together a group called the Introductory Psychology Initiative, and one of the things that came out of that group, and I know you probably can't read this now, but if you go to apa.org/IPI, you can find these. They are the introductory psychology recommended outcomes for the course. Up until this point, a couple years ago, there were no recommended outcomes for the course, at least not from the American Psychological Association. So I wanted to see, though, does the APA's mission line up even down through these introductory psychology recommendations? And I think they do. So if we look at the outcomes, this 1.3 says apply psychological principles to personal growth and other aspects of everyday life. So application is a big piece here. And then I just love this personal growth piece. I'm a little biased in that I kind of tend towards humanistic a little bit. And I just really like that from my students in my classes. And then for scientific thinking, which is the second outcome, solve problems using psychological methods. Again, very applied. Here's another one. This is one of the 7 key themes, which is really a nice piece of IPI. If you haven't read this, read through these 7 themes. It makes intro psych a little more memorable. But applying psychological principles can change our lives, our organizations, and our communities in positive ways. You see all this value stuff here. And a final one that's really important right now, fostering inclusion in pursuit of a more just society. So the IPI group really took this seriously, that intro psych is more than just stuff to know. It's stuff that can be applied. So I think APA's mission can be our mission. It can kind of work its way into the introductory psychology course, but it's easier said than done. The challenge is how do we do it? And that has always been my problem with intro psych. It's always been the challenge, is I might have things that I want to do, but how do I do it? And so with Halloween upon us, let me tell you a scary story about introductory psychology. As I told you, I have been on sabbatical. I decided to overhaul my course. I'm going to show you the beginning of how this process looked for me. Up through that first 19 years of teaching this course, especially in the previous, the last 10 years, I was sort of Frankensteining my course together. So when I would hear something from one of you at a conference, or we'd be talking, I think that's a cool assignment, or you do it that way, I'd just start building those things in. And it was alive. It came alive, but it wasn't great. I wouldn't say, that my monster was thriving, and it lacked coherence. I was well aware, being a teacher, and I don't think I consider myself in one of those, that top 10% tier that Ken Keith was talking about. I think I consider myself somebody who wasn't prepared for teaching, who was a slow learner at it, and really just learned by the generosity of others and just kind of modeling what other people were doing. That's true. Thank you. Yeah. We can tell you more at the pub later about that. But what if there was a better way? What was it worth an overhaul of my entire course to get to? Could I actually get there? By the way, I don't know. And I've just started. I'm 3-4 weeks into my class. And so I've just started. But here's how it started for me. I knew I wanted to start with outcomes. APA put out these great recommendations. It's really an expression of the mission of APA, and I really believe in it. And so let's start with the IPI specific outcomes. I knew I wanted to do that. And then I knew that content would be a piece of that, right? Because the IPI outcomes, actually, there are 3 outcomes, and only one of them is content specific. And then even of that, you can kind of get around a lot of content in most of the outcomes. Now, the outcomes were written to be non-prescriptive. So you could, in some ways, interpret those or use different content to get to those outcomes, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. So I knew I had to deal with content, but then there's all these skills that I wanted to include, right? We have so many opportunities for students to develop skills. In the teaching of psychology world right now, people have really been pushing skills, maybe even more than content in this course, because there is this feeling that skills might go on with you further than content will. And then I was like, okay, well, there are other IPI recommendations as well. So now I'm going to deal with IPI outcomes. I'm going to deal with content. I'm going to deal with skills. There are these other IPI recommendations for what kind of training should I be relying on in my intro psych course? What's my course design? All these things. And then I was like, okay, well, how do you do those things? I'm sure there's resources out there that will help me. Let's take a look at the resources. If you Google resources for introductory psychology, it's a nightmare in itself, okay, to navigate all that. And so here I was. By the time I got here, it felt like I was here. It felt so confusing. I didn't know where to start. I was turned around. I've been doing this for a long time, and I knew what I wanted to do. And yet, it was confusing. So if you've ever felt like introductory psychology is hard, it's because it's hard. Sue's going to tell you it's the hardest class that you teach. Okay. Do we have any data? Well, not much at all about how students learn in introductory psychology. This study by Landrum and Gurung is one that people point to quite a lot because it's one of the only studies where we track student learning in introductory psychology a couple years later. Now, it has limitations to it. Specifically, I think probably multiple choice testing is what they use, pre-post test, the same exact test twice. And so it's a piece of data, but it's only a piece of data. And what they found was that, about half the content was remembered 2 years later. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I don't know. Like, where would you have been happy at with your introductory psychology content 2 years later? I'm not sure. Like, did they learn something? Maybe. But we could use some good data. So, and I think it would get published, actually, if we could find some interesting ways to assess what students are learning by approaching introductory psychology in different ways. But if we are going to achieve anything memorable, this is the conclusion I came to after a year of just thinking about this, talking to a lot of people about this, is we need to simplify things. At least I need to simplify. You're probably smarter than I am, so maybe you don't need to simplify things like I do, but I do. I need to simplify those IPI outcomes a little bit. My MO is to take those 14 outcomes, so there's kind of there's 3 major outcomes and then there's sub-outcomes, okay? And my MO would be to take those 14 sub-outcomes and just try to hit every single one of them. It's a problem. It's like I'm addicted to outcomes, okay? And I had to really let that go. And so simplifying intro psych outcomes to me looks like the 3 categories of psychology content, scientific thinking, and key themes. The content you can't get away from, right? The content is recommended. It's recommended that for intro psych that you're covering the breadth of psychology for students. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means and what kind of choice and freedom you have in that in a moment. But there's also this scientific thinking piece, which I agree with Ken Keith that it might be the most important thing that we can give to students, especially in introductory psychology. And he's not alone. Dave Myers, the best-selling intro psych textbook author, would agree. I had a conversation with him. He said it's the one thing that students need to know. And then these key themes are really, really nice. I showed you some earlier, but they hold a lot of content. And they almost tell a story about the content. And they weave through the course, and you can attach content to these themes, and that might give it a chance at becoming more memorable. But I think we also need to simplify how we get to the outcomes. I like thinking about outcomes as a road trip. I'm in Seattle. We're in Worcester. There are unlimited ways to get from one side of our country to the other. You know what the outcome is. The outcome is the destination. But you should be able to get there in many, many different ways. You should be able to get there in a different way than I get there, and we both can get there responsibly. This is the pillar model from the APA, and this lets us off the hook of teaching 16 chapters in a textbook, okay? I am down to probably half the content in an introductory psychology, traditional textbook. And I feel responsible, even when I'm doing that, because I am using this pillar model, which says cover 2 topics, 2 areas in each of the pillars, and that is considered giving students this broad overview of psychology. And so I teach a lot of, I leave some chapters out, I teach some partial chapters, and it makes things more manageable for me, again, simplifying. And then finally, this is Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. I'm not sure if you've ever read it, but it's really about purpose. It's what is the purpose of your course? In the abstract for this talk today, Sue and I said that we have a fundamental belief that intro psych should benefit the lives of our students and thus have a positive impact on their relationships, workplaces, and communities. And, we're going to double down on that as a good mission for the course, and one that, again, aligns to the APA and to Guidelines 3.0 and to the Intro Psych Initiative. But here's the thing about a good course mission. Once you get mission right, it simplifies this question of content for you. It becomes a North Star, sort of, for making course decisions. And so I want to give you just a couple of examples in a moment of what these mission statements could look like in your intro psych course, if you ever find yourself in the position of overhauling things. But I do think that mission does a few things. Your course values, and that's what I've been talking about, they really get aligned. Like, what is it that you think students need to know in the course? but also your values. You get to start to infuse your own uniqueness into the course if your mission allows for it. If you build it into a mission of a course, your course decisions become much easier, because if you have a good mission statement for your course, you can look at it pretty simply and against any opportunity and think, does that fit or does it not fit? And then finally, some coherence to the course. I once gave a talk like this to a group of people. A year later, a high school teacher came up to me and said, I was trying to figure out how to teach my course. I basically chose the one thing. I chose one thing and designed my course around it, and it worked like a charm. So it was lovely. Here's some sample mission statements as we get going. You could do kind of any kind of mission statement that really fits you and is responsible to introductory psychology. Oh, but here's one. This course emphasizes critical thinking about self, others, and the world. That could be your one overarching theme or mission of the course. Other decisions become easier with that. Also, this course promotes equity in pursuit of a more just society. You can really design things around that. It doesn't mean you're going to hit it every time, every lecture or activity, but you could in many cases. And then this course improves students' lives, communities, and relationships. And that's, again, where I've landed with things. I did start this term an assignment of impact, and that's what I'm calling it for my students. I really want it to be beneficial and applicable to their lives and community. And so I had them create an infographic that warns of the cognitive and social traps related to a topic that is politically divisive. And so I had students make up all kinds of things, produce all kinds of things with infographics. And this was like really high level to me. Don't let these psychology concepts influence your opinion on immigration. And then they walk through all the traps that people could fall into on either side of this argument. Well, that's it from me. And so I hope that you find an authentic way to teach your course that helps you. And now, Sue Frantz.
You can call them. That's fine.
Thank you.
So Garth noted that intro psych is the hardest course we teach, and it absolutely is. Mostly because we're incompetent at most of it. So just really briefly, here are some chapters from an intro psych textbook. The gold stars represent my area. So my degree is in social psychology. I felt pretty good about the social psych chapter, about research methods. Intro, I can handle that. My undergrad courses that I had taken were these. Okay, so I felt like it had been a few years since I had taken those courses, but in reading the chapter, I felt like I could get up to speed. I could get there. And then all the rest of these, I had no freaking clue. So all of that is learning on the fly. And of course, we take our most inexperienced instructors and throw them into the intro psych classroom. So on the plus side, they're usually the closest to at least having the undergrad classes. So they're a little bit ahead of the most experienced instructors. However, intro psych is the most important course that we teach. And one reason is because of the number of people who take it. So there are about 1.4 million U.S. college students per year who take intro psych. That's an estimate. There are about 6% psych majors. That's also it's a pretty good guess. Of all the bachelor's degrees that are awarded, 6% go to psychology majors. So probably about 6% of the students in our intro psych class are psych majors. Some of those majors aren't taking our intro psych class. They took AP psych. Anyway, we don't really know how many. When I've asked audiences of a couple hundred people who teach intro psych about what percentage of your students are psych majors, 5 to 10% is what people say. So I'm going with the 6%. So that means about 1.3 million students in the U.S. take intro psych every year. That's a boatload of people. And these are the people who are going into business, healthcare, law enforcement, computer science, education, finance, politics, you name it. This is our opportunity to tell them how important psychology is. So what is it that these 1.3 million people, who I think of as our neighbors, when I was living in Seattle, That's when I was really thinking about this. And I was looking at who my neighbors were, and a lot of them had college degrees. And they were working in these fields. And I knew that with their college degrees, a bunch of them had taken intro psych. So what is it that they really need to know about psychology? And here are the themes. I like this particular display because they're all in nice little colored boxes. So again, you've got the PowerPoint. If you didn't download it at the beginning, if you were waiting to see, is this going to be worth it? Again, we'll have it at the end. All right. For everything we choose to teach, we choose not to teach something else. With intro psych, oftentimes we just dive in and teach whatever our textbook says. Or I remember the first time I taught intro psych was as a graduate student. And the graduate student who was ahead of me, who was on her way out, she picked up all of her intro psych course materials and handed them to me. And that's what I used. There wasn't any thought about what am I teaching? Why am I teaching this? It was just self-preservation. I just have to get through this at least one class period ahead of my students. So I've since spent quite a bit of time thinking about what our neighbors need to know about psychology and what they don't. So now we're going to get down into the weeds. What do they need to know and what they don't need to know? And this is all personal opinion. So if you agree with my opinion, tell me afterwards. If you disagree, send me an email. Okay. Okay, what our neighbors do not need to know about psychology's history. There's a whole bunch they don't need to know. Keep in mind, we're talking about healthcare professionals, law enforcement. Okay, they do not need to know about Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Hobbes, Rousseau, structuralism and functionalism, for the love of God. So I have an intro psych textbook, and when I sat down to revise it, I'd been talking with people for a number of years about this traditional history we don't need to share. So I sat down to revise the book, and the first chapter, it's all of these people were in it. Like, okay, I can't include this. I've been telling people, no, I can't include this. So I emailed my publisher, and I said, yeah, I'm taking this out. I got an immediate email back saying, do you have time for a phone call? Okay, chapter 1, I'm already busted. So the compromise was, okay, we can take the traditional history, we're going to pick it up out of here, we're going to move it to an appendix. If anybody wants it back, they can pick it up and put it back in. But it can't be here. I can't put my name on that if it's here. But then the question was, well, what history do people need to know? So, being the reasonable person that I am, I did the only smart thing. And I contacted 3 of my favorite psychology history buffs. So I emailed Ken Keith, Barney Bynes, and Linda Wolf. And I said, okay, what is it that our neighbors need to know about the history of psychology? And they were largely in agreement from what I can recall. And I can say this because we just had a conversation with Ken and he didn't remember what he said. So, okay, Wundt. And we need to know about Wundt because he was a physiologist and he brought scientific methods, most notably experimentation, over from the natural sciences. And so that's why the first psych lab was so important. And I dutifully memorized 1879, first psych lab. I had that from intro psych when I had taken it 35 years ago, whatever it was. But why was it important? Well, that's why. So we can call him the father of psychological science. So that emphasizes to students right off the bat, we're talking about science here. Okay, next. They said, you got to talk about them. You recognize them? Okay, so Mimi and Kenneth Clark. I knew about the doll study. I knew about that. So as a quick overview, in the 1930s, largely driven by Mimi Phipps Clark, she said, well, let's find out how little kids basically perceive themselves. So, took black children, do you prefer the black baby doll or the white baby doll? And they preferred the white baby doll. So this is clearly messed up. So, a number of years later, we're coming up on early 1950s. Mimi Phipps, here's the part that I did not know. So I knew about the doll study, here's what I didn't know, but everybody should know. So, 1950s, early 1950s. And Thurgood Marshall, who was lead counsel for the NAACP, he, I think, knew Mamie Phipps Clark because she had been a paralegal. So he was familiar with their 1930s research. Good, you know this?
Yes, and I teach it. I talk about it.
Oh, fist bump, fist bump. Boy, I hope I get it right.
Yeah, it's toward Bradley Ford. Yeah.
Yeah! So, holy cow, everybody knows this. I didn't know this. Where were you? Did you know this too?
I learned it in my developmental course.
Okay.
But I've not been able to cover it in my course.
Okay. So for everybody else, it was like, what is so exciting? So Thurgood Marshall, he goes to them and says, hey, can you run this study again? That was done in the 1930s. Can you run it again? Can we see if we get the same results? They say, sure. They get exactly the same results. Thurgood Marshall then takes that data. He argues before the Supreme Court of the U.S. that, hey, segregation is a bad thing. Here's some data for this. And I just learned earlier today that that was the first time that psychological data had been used in a court case, Supreme Court case. So sure enough, it played a significant role in overturning in Brown versus Board of Education. The segregation laws that kept white and black children separate led black children to have a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. That quote came from Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, and that was in the majority opinion. So we know that that data had a significant impact. Our neighbors need to know that psychology can produce data that can have wide-ranging impacts. Okay, who else? This is Lillian Gilbreth. Lillian Gilbreth is my new hero. She is arguably, I'm going to call her the founding mother of industrial organizational psychology. So, she and her husband Frank, she died in 1972. So she and her husband Frank in the early 1900s became known for the time and motion studies. She and Frank would take this new technology called video cameras, movie cameras on the old reels. They would go in and they'd be hired by a company to film employees working. And they would analyze what the employees were doing as they did their jobs to find more efficient ways of doing those jobs. How could this workspace be rearranged, for example? So she and Frank are doing this. They have contracts with all of these companies. They're becoming really well known for efficiency experts. And actually all those employee suggestion boxes, that was theirs. They're the ones who said, put in these suggestion boxes so people can give feedback anonymously. Rest breaks, those were theirs as well. You want people to continue to work efficiently, give them a break every now and then, for the love of God. Okay, so 1924, Frank is on his way to a conference. He suddenly dies. Lillian, who is totally badass, goes to the conference in his stead and delivers the talk. I suspect she had written the talk. Anyway, so after this, all of the companies that had contracts with them, the contracts evaporated. Basically said, a woman doesn't know anything about business, about factory work. So everything evaporates. Lillian basically says, well, women belong in the kitchen, eh? She went into the kitchen and made our kitchens much more efficient. Fridge door shelving, that's hers. And it's all in the name of efficiency. Imagine your fridge didn't have any shelves in the doors. Fridge butter compartment, that was hers. Pedal trash cans. I'm on a quest to call them Gilbreths. Those were hers. L-shaped, if your kitchen is L-shaped, countertop, that's hers. The fact that it's level, that's hers. Triangular placement of the fridge, the stove, and the sink, that's Lillian Gilbreth. To give you an idea of what kitchens looked like, This was an efficient kitchen in 1917. Everything was its own independent piece of furniture. After Lillian Gilbreth, we have my kitchen. So you can see the nice little countertop and in the L shape, and then the triangular placement of the stove, the refrigerator, and the sink. And the perimeter of that triangle, she said, should add up to be no more than 26 feet. And ours is 21 feet, because I measured. Because why not? So we need to know about Lillian Gilbreth. And I have an assignment in my online class. So I had a Highline student online. And every week, the students are asked, as part of this online discussion, to pull out something interesting that they found in the chapter and talk a little bit about it. So this student, and I've put this up here with her permission, I thoroughly enjoyed reading all of chapter 1.4, which is the history section of chapter 1. I like learning about the history of psychology. Okay, let's stop there just for 1 second. I have taught intro psych for over 30 years, and this is the first time I have ever had a student say, I like learning about the history of psychology, and who played a significant role in shaping the world we live today. The part about Lillian Gilbreth was fascinating to me. She seemed like such a strong, intelligent woman, and I would love to know more about her story. I can't imagine how hard it would be to first go through with getting a PhD, and to top it off, be 9 months pregnant. She was frequently 9 months pregnant. They had 12 children. Right? But then to face the adversity of being told as a woman you didn't have anything to offer, even with such a prestige education and brilliant mind. However, that didn't stop her. She just found a new way to help the world around her in ways that impacted and lasted throughout the years, which I thought was inspiring. Here's the important part. When I think of psychology, I feel like my mind narrows to only a few select things. Beginning to hear about her story and the others in that section of the chapter opened my eyes to see how much psychology is everywhere in the world. And she totally got what it was I was trying to accomplish with that little bit of history. And now, for these students, every time they walk into their kitchen, I hope they think about Lillian Gilbreth, because I do. The other people in that section, it was Lillian Gilbreth, the Clarks, and William Marston. Who created Wonder Woman. Okay, what do our neighbors need to know about learning? This is kind of like my top 25. They need to know concrete examples of why operant conditioning is important, and for me, the hero rats are the epitome of that. Okay, you're a fan of hero rats. We're going to be good friends.
I went to undergrad with one of the people who's doing the program there now.
Oh, that is awesome. Yeah, they've been fantastic. I wanted a picture of hero rats for the intro psych textbook, and they immediately emailed my editor back and said, sure, you got permission to do that. And by the way, here's our most recent data. So there, you can put that in. And it was an immediate response. So, here, are you familiar with, aside from you, hero rats? All right, so hero rats, this guy who is in the Netherlands. He decided, we've got all these landmines that are all over the world, and when people accidentally step in these landmine fields and die and lose body parts and so on, he said, so here's an idea. How about we train these African giant pouched rats? They weigh about 2 pounds. They're 2 feet long, nose to tail. Let's train them up. Let's use basic operant conditioning principles, train these rats. They're too light to set off the mines, but they've got good noses, so they can sniff out the mines. So they were trained to do that, and they've also been trained to sniff out tuberculosis. So I adopted Carolina here, which just basically means you send them like $100 and they give you a bunch of information. But they've been giving me updates on how Carolina's been doing and how successful she is. And they sent this handy dandy info on how they actually do the training for tuberculosis detection and what the process is once the rat has been trained. And then one more time, just because they're so freaking cute. But it's a really concrete example of operant conditioning principles in action, at the same time giving some of our students who aren't familiar with how life can be in other parts of the world, that, hey, you got communities that are living with tuberculosis and communities that are living with landmines. And how about we all just get together and use psychology to make the world a better place? On the classical conditioning side, some concrete examples there would be nice. And one of my favorites is about drug use. And that some drugs, like heroin and opiates, can be classically conditioned. So if you're always using that drug in the same place, you develop a tolerance for that place. Basically, our bodies can see it coming. So then if you use the drug outside of that location, your risk of overdose is much greater. And I had a student who told me one day after class, thankfully he didn't point this out in class, but after class, he said 3 times he has overdosed on cocaine. And he said, I didn't know anything about this, but in looking back at that, all 3 were in places I didn't usually use the drug. And I've got references here for you. Okay, on the neuroscience side, what do people need to know? Need to know about neurotransmitters. That's where all the action is for us. And you notice that throughout the rest of the intro psych course, neurotransmitters get revisited over and over again. If you need to give up something, give up the action potential. If you talk about the sodium-potassium pump, you can let that go. It is okay. I had 3 biopsychologists freak out at me at ACT, actually, about that. I first mentioned that like 6 years ago, and they still remember. They all bonded over that. Drugs. How drugs work, what they do, signs of overdose, and traumatic brain injury. Concussions, strokes included. That our students need to know about that. If you're not out of biopsychology and you feel a little weak on biopsychology, Garth and I were talking about this earlier. Sam Keen is a science writer. He wrote a fantastic book called The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons. And it will give you fantastic stories for different parts of the brain. Okay, on the personality side, what our neighbors do not need to know about personality? The history of personality theory. When you look at most intro psych textbooks, half of the chapter is history of personality. A few years ago, a few of us, I co-chaired this task force. It was a Division I General Psych, Division II Teaching Psych, a task force on figuring out what content we should be teaching in intro psych. And we asked a bunch of researchers. So the personality theorists came back and said, here's an idea. How about we not teach pre-World War II theories of personality in the personality chapter? If you're paying close attention, that means you now have permission to not teach Freud. Now, some of you are like, good, because I haven't been. Others of you are like, oh, thank God. And some of you are having a visceral reaction that's more along the lines of, but I like teaching Freud, or I want to teach Freud because of cultural references. That culturally he is out there. Personally, I think culturally he continues to be out there because we keep teaching it. But if you have a good reason, and you may, for teaching Freud, the one thing that I ask is that you don't test on students' knowledge of his theory. Because as soon as you ask students to memorize this and spend time learning this, it elevates it into, oh, this must be currents. Otherwise, why am I being asked? So talk about it if you want. Give students context for this if you want. But boy, was that an epiphany for me. The first time I had students in class who were debating a multiple choice question that I had on the exam, which was, I know it was hilarious. What was an example of a defense mechanism. And they were in a big, deep discussion about it. And I'm thinking, my God, what have I done? This is not where I want them spending their time. So why am I even asking test questions about it? Why am I? Anyway, okay. So what should we be talking about? Modern theories of personality, including the Big Five and Hexaco models. And let's talk about why the Myers-Briggs is not a good measure of personality. Myers-Briggs is all freaking over the place. Students are encountering it all kinds of places, and I've given you a whole list here. I'm not going to go through these, but I wanted you to have them. Here's a whole list of reasons why the Myers-Briggs is bad. Okay, over on the social side, let's stop talking about the Stanford Prison Study. I could give a whole talk just on that. If you have not read Letexier's American Psychologist article debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment that came out in 2019, it took me a few years to read it. It came out in October 2019. I was behind on my reading, and then March 2020 happened, and then all reading stopped. So I finally got back to this about a year and a half ago, and it blew me away. If you have not read this, before you talk about the Stanford Prison Study again in intro, please read that American Psychologist article. If you have any trouble getting it, contact me. I will get you I'll get you a PDF.
I use it as an example of bad research ethics and design.
Yeah.
More at the research methods level, but like
Yep.
and how it's important to rethink and reevaluate science critically.
Yeah.
But that's the only way I address it.
Nope, that's a great way to do it.
It's required reading in my social psychology course.
Yeah. I took it out of intro psych. It is in my social psych text, but it took me a long time to figure out what to do with that. And I ended up giving it as an example of demand characteristics. So fantastic. As a little side note, Letexier, who wrote this article, is not a psychologist. He's a French filmmaker. He and I had a very interesting exchange. Part of it was in my poor French before we switched to his pretty good English. And he had heard about the Stanford Prison Study. I shouldn't tell the story. I don't have enough time. Too bad. Inside scoop. So he had heard about the Stanford Prison Study. He was thinking this would make a really good documentary. He got a grant from a film company to go to Stanford and dig through the archives. He goes to Stanford, he digs through the archives, and he's like, this archival record does not match the narrative. The narrative that we have heard from a certain person has been this, in this study, randomly selected into guards and prisoners. Nobody was given any instructions, and my God, look what happened. And Letexier is like, yeah, no, the archive says that this was a study on stress in prisoners, and that the guards were given instructions on how to behave, including those middle of the night counts. They didn't make that up. They were instructed to do that. And the guards believed that they were working for the experimenter, and that their goal was to make it as stressful as possible so that the prisoners would be stressed to see what the effects would be. Well, that whole narrative completely changed. And the prisoners said, yeah, no, we never felt like we were in a prison. I mean, you could hear the phones upstairs, the copy machines. People were constantly traipsing through. They said, on the second day, we talked about breaking out because that'd be fun. And they were afraid that the experiment would end. They were being paid by the day, but only for the days when they were actually going to be there. So it was in their best interest to drag this out as long as they could.
My students have a whole paper on this that student iPad 11:59 p.m.
11:59 p.m. tonight. Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll look forward to reading those. Okay, so that needs to go, but seriously, read that article. Okay, let's stop talking about Kenny Genovese. Not a good example of for a whole bunch of reasons, not a good example of the bystander effect. There are a bunch of good examples. We do need to talk about the helping model and the bystander effect. Absolutely. There are lots of good examples. I have been using a website put out by the Truckload Carriers Association. They have a Highway Angel program where truck drivers are nominated to get an award for helping out on the highways. And there are some really good examples there of traffic just going by and nobody stopping. Intimate partner violence. This really needs to be part of the social psych chapter. We talk about relationships, we talk about aggression, we need to talk about them both. I recently gave a version of this talk at New Mexico State University for their psychology department, and there were 4 young women, all graduate students, who as soon as this slide came up, they were all nodding like this. I'm like, okay, all kinds of stories there. And in-groups and out-groups, high value in talking about in-groups and out-groups. And if you have not seen this video, all that we share, highly, highly recommended, YouTube, all that we share. And I got the link there. So again, if you want this. Okay, sensation and perception. We asked the sensation and perception researchers, what do we include, what not to include? They said take out all of this, which includes accommodation, dark adaptation, feature detectors, and in case you were wondering, you can also take out phase locking / frequency theory versus tonotopic mapping. So you don't have to talk about that in intro. Hey, I have no idea. You don't have to talk about that anymore. And this red QR code, that's the full report if you want to hear what all of the researchers had to say about their areas. Some of the stuff that we got was really good. So what should we talk about? They said 3 basic themes. We don't directly perceive the world. We perceive a mental representation, which is based on interpretation. Perception is affected by experience. It brings together nature and nurture. And to understand perception, we need to explore the relationship between physiological and mental processes. So they said if research, the sensation and perception researchers said, if students get that, fantastic. And then I give you a couple of my favorite examples. That and the dress. Gold. Who's gold white? Team gold white? Okay. Okay. Therapy. We can take out the history of therapy. We don't need that. Again, Freud, let him go. But there are a lot of things that students need to know about therapy that are not in the traditional book. And that includes the different kinds of practitioners. Boy, is that a mess. When I was revising, I spent a lot of time figuring out, okay, what are the differences? I think I finally got it. Need any help with that? National Alliance on Mental Illness is the go-to. The ethics code for therapists. Students need to know. If you're going to see a therapist, this is the ethics code. Types of therapy. Absolutely need to know about those. Need to know you're going to sit face to face, not on the freaking couch. And then some tips on how to find a psychotherapist, what happens in the first psychotherapy session, and the questions to ask a psychotherapist because you're shopping. So all of that needs to be in the therapy chapter. Consciousness, stress, and emotion. Importance of sleep. I never used to cover sleep. And then about 15 years ago, I thought, oh my God, I got to cover sleep. How to get good sleep. And societal and environmental contributions to sleep quality disparity. This was eye-opening for me. So I just have this up here as a screenshot. You've got it as a reference. But we frequently talk about sleep as in you personally have to make these changes in your life to get good quality sleep. Well, as it turns out, there are a whole bunch of environmental factors that could be affecting us. Black and Hispanic workers are more likely to work nights, and those who work the night shift are less likely to get enough sleep. People of color tend to reside in brighter areas where they're exposed to approximately twice as much ambient light at night as white people. Then we got to worry about air pollution and nighttime noise and the stress of being the target of, or the fear of being the target of, prejudice and discrimination. So that's going to interfere with sleep too. So we should be talking about all of those things. Talk about strategies for managing stress. I'm a big fan of the PERMA model of well-being. When you look at, if you ever go to a bookstore, Barnes & Noble keeps reinventing itself, but if you go to a bookstore and you look at the self-help section, it's largely about happiness. So let's talk about happiness and what the actual research is. Emotion regulation. We have got to talk more about emotion is frequently a chapter that we dump. We know that from survey evidence. But boy, is it important. So here are 5 different kinds of emotion regulation, just so you have them. But when you look at people just flying off the handle, it's largely an emotion regulation problem. So we should talk about that. And then the last one I'm going to put up here is gender. And even if you don't cover gender in a standalone chapter, throw it in adolescence during the lifespan chapter. I'm a big fan of the gender unicorn. And then here's a study I don't have time to talk about. But basically what they're saying is that people who lean conservative tend to have a hierarchical view of good, bad, and people who lean more politically liberal tend to see things on a gray box continuum. So one place that we could really emphasize that continuumness is in talking about gender. So, okay, there you go. I love being on the East Coast because I can talk as fast as I want and everybody comprehends.
Yep.
Well, I think we're now officially over time. Thank you all for your wonderful attention.